Bertha has already come ashore, and the storm is falling apart much faster than most people expected it to. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm your weather reporter, and today is Thursday, July 23rd, 2026. If you take a quick look at the satellite picture right now, it might still seem a little scary at first glance. There's a huge, messy patch of clouds spread across a large stretch of the Gulf, covering water and coastline alike. But if you look closer, past that big, cloudy blob, you'll notice something important. The real center of the storm is pushed way off into one corner, almost hiding from the rest of its own cloud cover. That's not how a strong, healthy storm usually looks. There's a serious amount of wind shear slicing across the top of this system right now. In simple terms, that means powerful upper-level winds are tearing apart the thunderstorms almost as fast as they try to build, and pushing all of that stormy activity off to one side instead of letting it wrap neatly around the center the way a well-organized tropical system normally would. That is genuinely good news for anyone sitting in Bertha's path. Wind shear works in our favor during hurricane season, and today I want to walk you through exactly what that means for the storm surge and the other impacts we're watching before we zoom out to the Pacific and the Caribbean, because there is a lot happening out there too, and none of it should be ignored just because Bertha is grabbing the headlines. If you're subscribed to updates from this channel, you already get a notification the second I publish something new. But I'm not going to flood your feed with videos just to stay active in your recommendations. I would much rather only show up when there's something genuinely worth telling you, instead of repeating the same information over and over just to keep a posting streak alive. That kind of approach wastes your time, and I'd rather earn your attention than demand it. I know a lot of you watch these updates because you have family along the coast, or because you're planning travel through one of these regions, or simply because you like understanding what's happening in the atmosphere rather than just being told what to do. Whatever your reason for being here today, I'll try to give you enough detail to actually understand the situation, not just a headline and a warning graphic. Weather can feel overwhelming when it's presented as a wall of numbers and technical terms. So my goal today is to walk you through this the same way I'd explain it to a friend or a family member who just wants to know whether they need to worry. Let's start right where the headlines are. Bertha made its first landfall in St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana on Wednesday, becoming the second named storm of the 2026 Atlantic hurricane season. That alone tells you something about how the season is shaping up so far, and we'll get to that in a moment. By last night, the storm had already crossed back through the southeastern part of the state and was pushing out toward open water again, sitting roughly 75 miles southwest of New Orleans and about 135 miles east-southeast of Lake Charles, based on the most recent update available. Maximum sustained winds have dropped to around 45 miles per hour, which tells you this storm has lost a good amount of punch since it first made landfall. The storm is crawling west at only about 12 miles per hour, and it has shown no real change in strength or direction over the last several hours. That slow, steady pattern is actually part of why this storm has been fairly easy to track and predict, even with all its messiness. A tropical storm warning remains in effect from the Alabama-Mississippi border all the way over to Sargent, Texas, and that includes the greater New Orleans area and Lake Pontchartrain. So if you're anywhere along that stretch of coast, you are still technically inside the warning zone, even though the worst of the wind has already passed for most spots. Don't let the calm skies outside your window fool you into thinking the warning has been lifted. It hasn't, and it's still worth paying attention to official updates in your specific county or parish. For a little context, Bertha followed only a few weeks behind Tropical Storm Arthur, the first named storm of this year's Atlantic season, which had already made its own landfall in Texas back in June. That means we've now seen two named systems form in the Gulf inside of just over a month, which lines up almost exactly with the typical pace for an average hurricane season, where forecasters generally expect two named storms to have already formed by the middle of July. In other words, as unsettling as back-to-back storms might feel, we're not actually running ahead of a normal season. We're pretty much right on schedule. Here's the thing about Bertha that has made this storm easier to forecast than most storms we deal with. It has stayed lopsided and disorganized basically its entire life. Most of its heaviest rain and strongest wind have consistently sat south and east of the actual center, well offshore over open water, rather than wrapping tightly around a defined eye the way a more dangerous hurricane would. A storm like that tends to behave in a more predictable way, because it isn't holding together with the kind of tight, organized structure that can suddenly intensify overnight. Forecasters expect the center to keep drifting west and eventually push into the upper Texas coast by Friday, tracking somewhere near the stretch of coastline between Houston and Angleton, with the center possibly reaching the Brazos River area by early evening. But by the time it gets there, we are likely talking about a very weak remnant system, not anything resembling the storm that first came ashore in Louisiana. The Bertha that reaches Texas will be a shadow of the Bertha that hit Louisiana. And that's an important distinction to keep in mind as you watch different headlines and alerts roll in over the next couple of days. Some of these forecast models even show the center kind of hopping around unpredictably as it interacts with land. since a storm this disorganized does not always keep one clean, trackable center the way stronger systems do. If you hear another outlet or app claim the center has suddenly reformed somewhere new, do not panic. That is honestly a normal thing for a weak, sheared out system like this one to do, and it does not automatically mean the storm is getting stronger again. It's simply a reflection of how messy and spread out this system has been from the very beginning. I've looked at a handful of different forecast models for Bertha over the last day, and while they generally agree on the broad track sliding west along the coast, they disagree quite a bit on exactly how much strength the storm holds on to along the way. One particular model tends to run consistently too aggressive, showing a stronger outcome than I actually expect to verify once we see how things play out. When models disagree that much on strength but agree on the general path, my approach is usually to lean toward the more conservative numbers, since a storm already fighting this much wind shear rarely finds a way to surprise everyone by getting dramatically stronger out of nowhere. That is really the value of watching several different models side by side, rather than just picking whichever one gives the most dramatic headline, since any single model can have an off day. But when the majority of them agree on a general theme, that consensus tends to be far more trustworthy than chasing whichever outlier looks the most exciting on social media. I know it can be tempting to share the scariest looking model run you come across online, but I'd rather give you the boring, reliable picture than the flashy, unreliable one. Now let's talk about the storm surge, because even a weakening tropical storm can still push a meaningful wall of water onto the coast, and that is never something to brush off, no matter how tired the storm looks on satellite. Along most of the affected coastline, we are looking at storm surge values in the range of 1 to 3 feet above normal tide levels, with the higher end of that range, closer to 2 to 4 feet, expected across eastern Louisiana from the mouth of the Mississippi River over toward the Mississippi-Alabama state line. That kind of surge will not cause the catastrophic flooding you would see with a major hurricane, but it is absolutely enough to cause dangerous beach erosion, overwash on low-lying roads, and localized flooding in the usual low spots that always seem to fill up first, the same handful of intersections and driveways that flood every single time we get a strong onshore push of water. If you live right along the coast and you know your specific spot floods easily, that is exactly the kind of hyper-local situation where I trust your own judgment more than any general forecast, because you know your street better than any weather model ever could. Rainfall totals have generally run in the range of 2 to 4 inches along the immediate coast, with some spots picking up closer to 8 inches where the heavier rain bands parked for a while and simply refused to move on. A few isolated pockets could still see totals pushing toward the higher end of what forecasters had flagged earlier this week, so don't be surprised if your neighborhood ends up on the higher side of that range, even if the surrounding area stayed drier. Seas out in the northern Gulf have been running around 10 to 12 feet in spots, which is worth keeping in mind if you have any interest in boating or fishing over the next day or two, since even a weakening tropical storm can leave the Gulf choppy and dangerous for small craft well after the wind itself has died down. It's easy to assume that once the rain stops and the sky clears up, the ocean is automatically safe again, but that simply isn't true, and local boaters in particular should keep a close eye on marine forecasts before heading out. For anyone living in a low-lying neighborhood near the coast, this is also a good moment to think through the basics. Simple things like clearing storm drains near your property, moving vehicles away from spots that are known to flood, and checking that sump pumps are working properly can make a real difference, even with a storm as weak as this one. It's the kind of preparation that doesn't take much time, but can save you a lot of frustration if water does end up pooling where you least expect it. And if you've been through a storm season or two in your area, you probably already have a mental list of the streets and underpasses that flood first. Trust that local knowledge, because it's usually more accurate than any general map. Beyond the surge and the rain, we are also watching for a few other secondary hazards tied to Bertha. Gusty winds are still possible along parts of the Florida, Panhandle, Alabama, and the Mississippi coastline, with occasional gusts capable of reaching 40 to 55 miles per hour in the stronger rain bands. There's also always a small chance of an isolated, brief tornado or a waterspout spinning up in that kind of environment. The same way we saw with Tropical Storm Bertha back in June, which brought its own round of flooding and tornado damage to parts of Louisiana and Texas before Bertha ever formed. Beaches have been closed from Florida over to Mississippi as a precaution, while Bertha's tropical storm force winds, which stretch over 100 miles out from the center, continue affecting the coastline. Local officials in several coastal counties have also reminded residents that even a modest tropical storm like this one can produce dangerous rip currents along the beach for days after the center has moved on, since the ocean itself takes time to calm back down even once the wind and rain have moved through. Lifeguards along several beaches have already reported pulling swimmers out of stronger than usual currents, even in spots that never saw a drop of rain from Bertha directly. That is one of the more underappreciated dangers with any tropical system. The ocean impacts almost always outlast the actual storm on land by a good margin. So even after your local news stops mentioning Bertha by name, it's smart to double-check rip current conditions before swimming for the next several days. The overall message here is one of steady, gradual weakening. Bertha should keep losing strength as it drags itself along the coast and eventually inland. And while I will absolutely let you know if anything unexpected happens, right now this remains a monitor mode situation rather than an active emergency for most of the warned area. I would rather give you calm, accurate updates than throw out unnecessary alarms just to keep your attention, because nothing wastes your time and energy faster than getting prepared for a storm that never actually threatens you. And I know how exhausting it can feel emotionally to brace for a big storm over and over, only to have it fizzle out before it ever reaches you. That emotional exhaustion is real, and it's part of why I try to stay measured in how I present these updates. Let's shift now all the way out to the eastern and central Pacific, where Hurricane Fausto has become the first hurricane of the season out there and is putting on a much more impressive show than Bertha ever did. If Bertha has been the quiet, disorganized storm of the week, Fausto is very much the opposite story. As of the latest advisory, Fausto is a Category 1 hurricane with sustained winds sitting around 75 to 80 miles per hour, centered a few hundred miles southwest of the tip of Mexico's Baja California Peninsula and moving west-northwest at around 12 miles per hour. Hurricane force winds extend out about 25 to 30 miles from the center, while tropical storm force winds reach out much farther, up to about 160 miles in some directions. So this is a fairly broad system, even if the core itself is not enormous, which means its effects can be felt across a wide stretch of ocean, even before the center itself arrives anywhere. Forecasters expect Fausto to strengthen just a little more over the next day or so, but dry air has been interfering with the storm's inner core, giving it a somewhat ragged, disorganized appearance on satellite, even while the wind speeds hold steady. That's honestly a pretty common growing pain for hurricanes crossing this part of the Pacific in the middle of summer, especially this early in what forecasters are calling an above-normal season for the central Pacific Basin, with NOAA putting the odds at around 70% for more tropical cyclones than usual this year. Here is the encouraging part for anyone in Hawaii. The official forecast track keeps Fausto well east of the islands through the next several days. And once the storm moves into cooler ocean water and runs into stronger wind shear later in the week, a steady weakening trend is expected to kick in, with Fausto likely dropping back below hurricane strength by this weekend. That's a pretty reassuring setup if you live in the islands and have been watching this storm nervously since it first got its name. The National Weather Service office in Honolulu has said the storm's weakening remnants could begin influencing local weather early next week, as the system approaches the central Pacific, mainly in the form of a building ocean swell and slightly rougher surf along east-facing shores, rather than any direct wind or rain threat. Local forecasters there have described it as hopefully turning into just a big swell maker rather than an actual storm threat, which lines up with what the current models are showing. For now, there are no hurricane warnings, no watches, and no major red flags for Hawaii tied to Fausto. But it is exactly the kind of storm I plan on tracking start to finish, since these systems can occasionally surprise you once they get closer to land, even when every current model keeps them safely out to sea. Forecasts change, and a storm sitting comfortably offshore today can shift its track in ways that matter a great deal a few days from now. It's also worth remembering that Fausto being the first hurricane of the Central Pacific season doesn't automatically mean the rest of the season will follow the same pattern. Some seasons start with one strong system and then go quiet for weeks, while others build one storm right after another. Right now, all we can say with confidence is that this particular storm is behaving like a fairly typical early season hurricane in this basin, building steadily, fighting some dry air, and staying far enough offshore that it isn't a direct threat to any populated area just yet. I'll keep watching the track closely, especially once it gets within a few days of the islands, since that's usually when small shifts in direction start to matter the most. Meanwhile, back closer to Mexico, there's a bit more simmering in that same stretch of the Pacific. The weakening remnants of a system called Elida, which never quite managed to become the season's first hurricane, continue drifting northward off Mexico's west coast, gradually losing whatever organization they still have left. Elida had a shot at becoming something more organized earlier on, but it simply ran out of the right conditions to keep building. Right behind Fausto, forecasters are also watching a broad area of low pressure off the coast of Central America that has been given roughly a 70% chance of developing into some kind of organized tropical system over the next week, which is worth keeping an eye on if you have any travel or business plans anywhere along that stretch of coastline, since that particular disturbance has a decent enough chance of development that it deserves more than just a passing mention in today's update. Farther out toward Hawaii, there's a separate, much weaker disturbance sitting southwest of the islands that forecasters currently give only about a 20% chance of developing. And even if it does eventually organize, current thinking has it staying well clear of any direct impact on Hawaii itself. So while it's on the radar, it's not something that should cause any real worry for island residents right now. It is honestly a pretty busy stretch of ocean out there right now, with multiple systems in different stages of life, all lined up across the eastern and central Pacific Basin at the same time, which is not unusual for this point in the summer, but does mean there is genuinely a lot to keep track of if you live anywhere along that coastline or have travel plans through the islands in the coming weeks. I'll keep an eye on all of them and flag anything that starts to look more serious. Now, let's swing over to the Caribbean, where the story right now is honestly more about dust than anything tropical. A fresh plume of thick Saharan dust is already pushing into spots like the Bay Islands of Honduras, the Cayman Islands, and the ABC Islands, along with parts of Colombia, Venezuela, and up through St. Lucia and Barbados. And there's another even thicker round of dust expected to sweep across the eastern Caribbean by Friday, covering Jamaica, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and stretching all the way up through the Virgin Islands, St. Kitts and Nevis, Montserrat, and over toward St. Martin and St. Bart's. If you live in any of those spots, you can generally expect hazier skies, more vivid sunsets, and noticeably suppressed rain chances for a few days while that dust sits overhead, since dry, dusty air tends to choke off the moisture that storms and showers need to form in the first place. Rain chances across most of the eastern Caribbean are running fairly low right now as a result, generally sitting somewhere between 10 and 30% through the rest of the week, island after island, from Guadeloupe and Antigua down through St. Vincent and the Grenadines. A handful of islands closer to the western Caribbean, like Cuba and Jamaica, are still catching the occasional pop-up shower or storm despite the dust, with rain chances there running closer to 30 to 60% on any given afternoon. So it is really a very mixed picture, depending on exactly where you're sitting in the basin, and it's worth checking your local forecast rather than assuming the whole region is behaving the same way. That said, not everywhere in the wider Caribbean basin is stuck in that dry pattern. Costa Rica and Panama have actually been dealing with the opposite problem lately, with waves of much heavier rain moving through overnight and into the morning hours. Some spots in that region could pick up as much as 6 inches of additional rain over the next few days, which is enough to raise a real concern about localized flooding in the lower-lying areas that tend to hold water after repeated rounds of heavy rain, particularly in neighborhoods built along smaller rivers and drainage canals that simply were not designed to handle this much rainfall stacking up night after night. That same pocket of moisture, sitting over Central America, is actually one of the ingredients forecasters are watching as a possible seed for the next tropical system to try to organize somewhere out ahead of us. There's also a fresh tropical wave moving off the coast of Africa that has started to hang together a bit more than some of the earlier waves this season, and forecasters are hopeful that some of that moisture eventually makes its way toward the western Caribbean, including Nicaragua and the Providencia and San Andres Islands by the weekend, since a good part of that region has honestly just been too dry lately and could use the rain, even if nobody wants to see it develop into anything stronger than a soaking rain event. It is a good reminder that tropical weather forecasting is never just about counting named storms. Sometimes the more useful story is simply where the rain is falling too much and where it is not falling nearly enough. And this week, the Caribbean is a perfect example of both of those stories playing out side by side. If you're traveling to the Caribbean over the next several days, it's worth checking which part of the region you're headed to before you pack. Someone flying into the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico should expect hazy skies and drier conditions overall, which is actually good news for beach days, even if the sunsets look a little different than usual because of the dust in the air. On the other hand, anyone headed toward Costa Rica or Panama should be ready for the possibility of heavier afternoon downpours, and should keep an eye on local flood advisories, especially if staying near a river or in a low-lying part of town. Weather in this region can vary enormously from one island or country to the next, even on the same day. So it really does pay to check the specific forecast for your destination, rather than assuming the whole Caribbean is experiencing the same pattern. Closer to home here in the southeastern United States, we are still dealing with the after effects of the severe weather that rolled through the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic earlier this week, which produced a handful of isolated tornadoes and some localized flooding in spots. That system may be old news in some circles, but its effects are still being felt. That same frontal boundary has been slow to clear out, and it is expected to keep sitting across the region into tomorrow, dragging scattered showers and thunderstorms along with it, from as far north as Quebec and the Maritimes, down through New England and into the Carolinas. North Carolina in particular looks like it will see a lot of that lingering rain, especially out toward the Outer Banks, where some spots could see an additional 6 to 8 inches piling on top of what has already fallen this week, adding up to what is honestly turning into a fairly sloppy, waterlogged stretch for that part of the coast. That same front stretches all the way down toward Georgia and South Carolina by Friday, where cities like Atlanta could see a good soaking as well heading into the weekend. Generally speaking, the southeastern United States looks more active with scattered rain and thunderstorm chances as we move from Friday into Saturday. So if you have outdoor plans anywhere along that corridor, it is worth keeping half an eye on the radar rather than assuming clear skies just because the tropical systems themselves are staying offshore. This kind of lingering frontal rain doesn't get nearly as much attention as a named tropical storm, but it can still cause its own share of problems, especially for anyone dealing with already saturated ground from earlier in the week. Roads that handled the first round of heavy rain just fine can start to flood on the second or third round, simply because the ground has nowhere left to send the extra water. If you live in one of these areas and notice standing water building up faster than it used to after a normal rainstorm, that's usually a sign the soil underneath is already full, and it's worth being a little more cautious than usual until things dry out. Local emergency management offices in several of these counties have also asked residents to avoid driving through flooded roadways, since it's often impossible to judge how deep the water actually is from inside a vehicle. And a surprising number of weather-related injuries each year come from people misjudging flooded roads rather than from the storms themselves. Putting it all together, today's forecast really comes down to one weakening storm finishing its business along the Gulf Coast, one strengthening hurricane staying safely out to sea for now in the Pacific, a Caribbean caught between thick dust in some spots and heavier rain in others, and a lingering frontal boundary keeping the eastern United States a little unsettled through the end of the week. None of this rises to the level of a major urgent alarm anywhere on the map today, which is honestly the kind of quiet, steady update I like giving you the most. Days like this, where every system on the board is either weakening, staying out to sea, or simply bringing routine summer rain, are exactly the kind of days that let weather reporters like me actually catch our breath a little, even while we keep watching every single one of these systems closely in the background, just in case something changes overnight. I will absolutely let you know the moment anything meaningful changes with any of these systems. Whether that is Bertha doing something unexpected on its way into Texas, Fausto taking a turn that actually brings it closer to Hawaii, or a brand new system finally getting its act together somewhere in the Caribbean or off the African coast. Until then, stay weather aware, take care of yourselves out there, and I will see you back here with the next update. Before I sign off, I want to say thank you to everyone who takes the time to actually read through updates like this one instead of just glancing at a headline. Tropical weather can feel confusing, especially when there are multiple systems active at once across different oceans, and it's easy to get lost in a mix of percentages, wind speeds, and unfamiliar place names. My goal is always to make this information usable, not just accurate, something you can actually apply to your own plans for the next few days, whether that means keeping an eye on a flooded street near your house, rethinking a boat trip, or simply deciding whether it's safe to let your kids play at the beach this weekend. If you found this update helpful, the best way to support the channel is simply to keep coming back when there's something worth covering, and to share it with anyone you know who might be affected by one of these systems, especially along the Gulf Coast, in Hawaii, or anywhere in the Caribbean right now. Weather affects all of us differently depending on where we live, and sometimes the person who needs this information most isn't the one already watching the news, but a friend or family member who hasn't checked the forecast yet today. A quick share can genuinely make a difference for someone who wasn't aware conditions had changed. That wraps up today's tropical weather roundup. As always, if anything shifts overnight with Bertha, Fausto, or any of the smaller disturbances we talked about today, I'll be back with a fresh update rather than making you wait for a scheduled time slot. Stay safe, stay calm, stay informed, and I'll talk to you again very soon.